Hello my friends, I welcome you back for the second tutorial about open source software. I'm Hudson Nandere Lubinga from Uganda. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel, and I urge you to invite your friends to also come and try to study and to understand open source software. Today we're gonna look at legal aspects, and this is our second part. Please, if this is your first time, make sure that you first go and watch the first video about legal aspects. That was part 1, and there was the general introduction tutorial about open source software, which I recommend that you should first watch and understand before you come to the legal aspects. So under this topic, this time we're gonna look at free software licenses. Also we shall look at the types of licenses, and these include permissive licenses and strong licenses. Then we have distribution under several licenses, and then program documentation. So what's a free software license? The free software license is simply a notice, or you can call it a document, that grants the recipient of a piece of software. So this is most probably the user. So this user is granted extensive rights, high-class rights, to modify or to change and to redistribute. That means the user can distribute again the software that they have acquired. So these actions, which actions are we talking about? The modification and redistribution are usually prohibited by the copyright law, but the rights holder, that's the author or the owner of the software, can remove these restrictions by accompanying the software or his product with a software license, and this license will now grant the user or the recipient of the software these rights to modify and to redistribute the software. So the software using such a license, a free license, at times it's called a free and open source software license, is conferred by the copyright holder. So the user is granted rights to use the software in whichever way he wants by modifying and redistributing the software through the license, and that is if it's a free software license. So these licenses are applied to software in the source code and also in the object code form. So we talked about the source code. That's the program that has been written by the programmer, and the object code form, that's the executable format in zeros and ones, the format of the software that the computer will execute. In most cases, that's the end product. So both of these, the source code and the binary code form, these free software licenses shall apply, and the copyright law recognizes both forms. So for the other side of the copyrighted software, still the copyright law will recognize both the binary object form and the source code form. So likewise, even for a free license or a free software license, both forms are recognized. Now let's talk about what a software license is. A software license is a legal instrument governing the use or redistribution of the software. So this legal instrument is usually by a way of a contract law with or the without printed material. So it can be in soft format or it can be printed, but it's legal in nature, an instrument that governs the use or redistribution of the software. The authors of the copyrighted software can donate their software to the public domain, in which case it's also not covered by copyright and as a result cannot be licensed. So if you have your software and it's copyrighted, still you can decide to donate your software to the public domain. A typical software license grants the licensee. The licensee is the person who has acquired the license, probably the end user who has bought the software. So this we are saying that a typical software license will grant that person the permission to use one or more copies of the software in ways where such a use would otherwise potentially constitute copyright infringement. So if you've bought the software and you have the license and the license grants you some permissions, then you are free to do as per the terms of the license. Otherwise, if you do what's not granted by the license, it is considered infringement or violation or breach of the license. Remember, the license is a contract by law, so you are violating or breaching the contract of the software. Much as you've bought it, you have to ensure that you use it as per the license agreement. Let's talk about the types of licenses. These are some of the common types of licenses for software. And when you look at this arrow, as you go this side of the right, the license becomes more restrictive. So this shows restrictiveness, meaning this type of license, the proprietary on the extreme right, is more strict as compared to this one on the extreme left, the public domain license. Now here we have some simple explanations for each type of license. Public domain license, anyone has the freedom to use it and to modify it. That is the software. So if you acquire or you get the software that uses the public domain license, you have that liberty to use it and to modify it in any way you want. Then you have the LGPL. Now LGPL stands for Lesser General Public License. We have what we call the General Public License, GPL, but this one is Lesser General Public License. What does this mean? Now, the founders of the LGPL license had a primary goal for software libraries, in that they thought you can link to the open source libraries within your own software, and the resulting code can also be licensed under any other type of license. So if you acquire the software which is open source, you are free to link to the open source libraries within your own software. Now when you link to those libraries, the resulting code after linking to those libraries within your software, the code that comes as a result is still, you are free to license it under any other type. So you can license the resulting code under public domain, under permissive, and so on. So that's what the Lesser General Public License is all about. And this LGPL was developed as a compromise between the strong copyleft of the GNU public license and the more permissive licenses such as the BSD licenses and the MIT licenses. So it was developed, in other words, to be the neutral ground between this license and the GPL. GPL is like the public domain license. Okay, then we have the permissive license. With this type of license, you have few restrictions or requirements for the distribution or modification of the software. Then we have the copyleft. This one is restrictive in nature. We discussed copylefts in the previous tutorial. It has restrictions and it's also known as the reciprocal license. One of the restrictions is that you must ensure that the freedoms that are granted are maintained even in the derivative works of the software. Then we have the proprietary type of license. This one is for the copyrighted software or the closed source software, those that are for commercial purposes mainly. This is the most restrictive license and it's ineligible for copying. It's not eligible. So if you want our software to be granted rights of copying, modification, or distribution, you can't go with this type of license. Okay. Now let's discuss about each type of license in a more detailed format. The public domain license is what we're gonna begin with. Now, when software is defined as being part of the public domain, this means that anyone is free to use and modify the software without restrictions. And this free here, we don't mean free in terms of cost, free of charge. No. But as in freedom, you have the freedom to modify the software without restrictions. This is a permissive license that allows adopting the code into applications or projects and reusing the software as desired. So you can get your code and modify it and then you reuse it in a way that you desire. Now, many businesses, when they have to adopt a public domain software, they have to take caution because most of the projects that use the public domain may not be perfect, may not be secure, may not be up to the standards of software applications. So you have to take caution, you have to be very careful when you want to adopt a public domain software as a project for your business. Okay, let's continue. We have the GNU or the LGPL, and this is the GNU Lesser General Public License. Now, under the LGPL license, the software developers have rights to link to the open source libraries within their own software. Okay, and when you acquire your product with the code, because it's open source software, that means the code is accessible to you. So you have that liberty to link your software to the already existing software libraries. And when you do that and do the modifications, the resulting code can be licensed now, not under only LGPL, but also under any other type of license as you desire, to the extent that you can even license your modification under the proprietary license for commercial purposes. Okay, and when projects are compiled or linked to include when the projects are compiled or linked to include an LGPL licensed library, that's what happens. You can choose any other kind of license uh, to be applied to the newly developed product or the modified product. But now the caveat or the warning, the caution that you should take is that any part of the library is copied into the code or modified, the terms of the original LGPL license will still apply to the developed code that used the library. Okay, that's what happens. So that's the warning that you should take. Any part of the library that is copied into your code or modified, the terms of the original LGPL license will apply to that developed code that used the library. So that part of the code that you have come up with that includes the library or that has used the library, for that part, the original terms of the LGPL license for the product will apply for that part of your code. Let's talk about the permissive license. Now, this type of license is one of the most unpopular among open source software licenses. Under the permissive license, you have few restrictions. So that means permissive licenses are not like the GPL, but rather they have restrictions, however much there are few. Or they have few requirements that enable you to distribute or modify the software. These licenses, the permissive, are also commonly known as the Apache or the BSD style licenses. Now this BSD is short for the Berkeley software distribution. BSD is Berkeley software distribution. This Berkeley software distribution is a discontinued operating system, and it's based on the research Unix. It was developed and distributed by the Computer Systems Research Group, that is the CSRG, and that was at the University of California in Berkeley. So that's where it derives its name from. And this Apache, for those of you who do not know, Apache is the most widely used web server software. This Apache was developed and maintained by the Apache Software Foundation, ASF. This Apache, interestingly, is an open source software. Okay, we have another variation of this kind of license, the permissive software license, and that's the MIT license. This is also common. Now the MIT license, as you have noted, is a permissive free software license, and it originated at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. That's the MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. So that's why it gets its name MIT from. And that was around in the late 1980s. This MIT license, if any software is licensed under it, that software can also be re-licensed as proprietary software, just like the previous license that you have talked about, the LGPL. And this distinguishes it from the copyleft, because we said for the copyleft, it requires, it's a must, it requires that freedom. It doesn't just allow the freedom, but it demands for it. But here you can redistribute your derivative work as even a proprietary software. Okay. Now, still, as you have noted, the permissive license has several variants. These include differences in the requirements for preserving license notices and copyrights for the software as well. Okay, as well as how the software may be used, whether commercial or private, trademark requirements, and other stipulations. Okay, let's continue. Let's talk about the copyleft. These licenses terms are restrictive, as we noted in the previous tutorial, and they are known as reciprocal licenses. Now, under the terms of the copyleft license, the license code may be modified or redistributed as part of a software project if the new code is distributed under the same software license. So, what does this mean? If you have your code and it's included in the software product, for example, and you specify that that code is for personal use only, the code that you modify still must be distributed under the same designation or restriction, the personal use only. So, since the original software is included with the new project, you have to allow the same freedoms as the original software in your modifications and in your distribution. So this kind of license, the copyleft, may not be the best license for a software developer. Why? Because the resulting code must also carry the copyleft license type, and this includes the availability of the source code. So if you are a software developer and mainly you want to carry out business, this kind of license may not be the best. Okay, let's talk about the proprietary kind of license. This one, as we've noted before, is mainly meant for commercial purposes, for copyrighted software. These software licenses make the software ineligible for copying, modifying, or distribution. So under this kind of license, you have no right to copy the software, to modify it, or to distribute it to your friend or anyone. Though in some countries, most especially some of our countries, in developing countries in Africa, some of these laws are not enforced strictly, but that doesn't mean that they don't exist. So as a software developer, if you are a professional developer, if you want to act professional, you have to ensure that you follow these licenses. If the license doesn't permit you to copy, modify, or distribute the product, the software product, please, I urge you, I appeal to you that don't dare you not copy or modify or distribute that software. You never know, it might land you into problems and you may be sued as per the license agreements. Okay, and we are saying that this is the most restrictive type of software license, protecting the developer or the owner from unauthorized use of the software. So if you want to own your software and you don't want any other person to modify, copy, or distribute your product, then you can go for this type of license. But open source software, no. Open source software do not go for this type of license, much as you may acquire software through the LGPL, and then after the modification you can put it under this kind of license that's allowed. Okay, these are the most popular examples of open source licenses that exist. So you can go through each of them, and in your free time you can go and try to read about each of these examples of software licenses. Let's talk about a software license agreement. Now, a software license agreement is simply a legal document. This document can be printed or it can be in soft form, and this document will stipulate or will highlight, will clearly show the several key conditions between a software company or a developer and a user to allow use of the software. Okay, these conditions that are stipulated in the document are designed to protect the developer's intellectual property rights and to limit claims against them for potential damage resulting from the use of their software. So this agreement, a document, basically is meant to help the developer's intellectual property rights in case of any damage resulting in case of any damage resulting from the use of their software, these people, the developers, are protected by the license agreement. So in some cases, the pricing and the terms of payment can be included as part of the software license agreement. Although this is not common, the pricing and the terms of payment are usually covered in a separate document. The primary purpose of the agreement is to provide the detailed background rules for the use of the software. And these are some of the examples of what the agreement is purposed to do. 1. Where the software may be installed and how many instances may be installed, how the software can be used, whether the software may be copied, modified, or redistributed, any copyrights that apply to the software, the ownership of the software. Most often, this here we are specifying what the provider retains. We are specifying that the provider retains all rights of ownership. Yeah. Then the duration of the terms of agreement and what constitutes correct usage of the software. How should you use the software, and where, and in which ways of usage of the software are right. So in brief, that's what constitutes the software license agreement. Okay. What are software licenses used for? We are saying that developers release the software for a number of reasons. Whether they want to demonstrate a new idea, whether they want to provide benefit to as many people as possible, or for financial and economic purposes, it's up to them. Whichever case, these developers will need the software license agreement. So in order to ensure that all the parties involved, the developers, all the owners, and the end users, there must be a clear process to define the terms and the conditions of the software. So these terms and conditions are expressed in what we are terming as a software license agreement. So software licenses are critical for software providers and users alike, and these are some of the reasons. Okay, one, we are saying written authority for use of the software. What does this mean? This protects the business users and individuals from liability and copyright infringement claims. Liability here, we are talking about the responsibility or the accountability in case there is a violation of the copyright. So the business owners are protected by this document. Then number two, these software licenses are used for clarification of the number of eligible users of the software. So it will clearly show who is eligible, who has the right to use the software. How many users have the right to use the software? Okay. Number three, we are saying definition of what's included: maintenance, upgrades, support, and so on. So this license will clearly stipulate what it covers. Is maintenance part of it? Upgrades part of it? Is support part of the agreement, and so on? So the license will clearly show all those details. Then number four, warranty agreements and problem mediation process. So in case of any fault in the product, what are the warranty agreements and what's the process of maybe obtaining a better version or another product? So all those agreements are clearly stipulated in the software license agreement. Then distribution permission and limitations. How many people and where and how can you distribute the product, or what are the limitations involved? Then number six, use rights such as copying or modifications. Are you allowed to copy or modify? Under which terms? What rights do you have? So all those are shown. Then copyright definition, including software and any documentation. Number eight, dates for installation, training, support assistance, and license duration. The termination terms, penalties, and financial liability. So in case of the breach of the contract, what terms, what are the penalties, what are the financial implications, or the financial accountability, and any performance guarantees and remedies. So all those are clearly shown by the software license agreement. Let's talk about the distribution under several licenses. The distribution of software under several licenses. As we noted before in our introduction, the very first tutorial, when we say open source, this doesn't just mean access to the source code, but rather the distribution terms of the open source software have to be followed, and we're gonna look at the criteria for the distribution of open source software. So these are the following that have to comply. The software must comply with these criteria that we're gonna look at. One, free distribution. So if software is open source, its distribution has to be free. What does this mean? The license should not restrict any party from selling or giving away the software. So that's what we mean by free distribution. So the license shall not require a loyalty or other fee for such a sale. Then number two, this distribution must involve or must have still the source code. So if you have your software, it's free and open source software. When it comes to a redistribution, or when you want to distribute the software, you must ensure that the source code is included in your distribution. Okay, and here again, when you have made the modification, still the source code must be part of the distribution. Deliberately obfuscated software code is not allowed. So if you deliberately write a code that is confusing or complicated, that's not allowed. Okay. Then another term that is supposed to be followed in the distribution is the derived works. The license must allow modifications and the derived works, and must allow them to be distributed under the same terms as the license of the original software. So here we mean when you make modifications from the open source software, what you get out of the modification is the derived works, the work that is derived from the software. That derived work has to also follow the same terms as the license of the original software from which it's derived. And number 4, integrity of the author's source code. So what does this mean? The license must explicitly permit distribution of software built from the modified source code. Okay. And the license may require the derived works to carry a different name or version number from the original software, but the author's source code has also to be taken note of his integrity. Number 5, we are saying no discrimination against persons or groups. So it is a requirement that if you're gonna distribute your open source software, you are not discriminative. Any person or any group of persons should be given right to access and use the software if you want to distribute your open source software. Then no discrimination against fields of endeavor. So whichever field, as long as the software can work there, there is no discrimination that should be put. So even if it's for business purposes, even if it's for any kind of research like genetic, even if it's for personal use, there shouldn't be any restriction, no discrimination. Okay. Number 7, distribution of license. So the open source software that you want to distribute must be still accompanied by the license. So you distribute it together with the license. Then the license, number 8, must not be specific to a product. Yeah. Here we mean that the rights attached to the program must not depend on the programs being part of a particular software distribution. So the rights that are attached to the program should not depend on the fact that that program is part of a particular software distribution. So you must not be specific. If the program is extracted from that distribution and used or distributed within the terms of the program's license, then all the parties to whom the program is redistributed should have the same rights as those that are granted in conjunction with the original software distribution. Number 9, we are saying that the license must not restrict other software. So if you're distributing your open source software, the license should not place any restrictions on other software that are distributed along with your licensed software. An example is your license must not insist at any way that in any way that all other programs distributed along with your product on the same medium must be open source. So your license shouldn't put those restrictions. You can distribute your program along with other programs that aren't open source. So the license should grant that freedom. And number 10, license must be technology neutral. There should be no provision of the license to be predicated on any individual technology or style of interface. So you shouldn't have a license that is only particular or only compatible for a certain style or for a certain interface or technology, but rather it should be general, technology neutral. Whichever style or interface of technology the license should apply. Let's talk about now the program documentation. As a software developer, for the software developers or software engineers, you are very much aware that software documentation is one of the critical processes in the overall software development. So we software engineers, we know that software documentation is very, very important. So this does not only apply for proprietary software, but also even for the open source software. So software documentation, or a software document or a program document, is simply any written text. It can be illustrations or video, and these, or it can be a combination of all these, that describe a software or a program to its users. So there are different types of documentations, but their aim is to describe that software or program to the users. These users may not necessarily be end users, but even other developers themselves, the developers themselves. These are software document will try to describe the software. So the user can be anyone, as I've been saying, the programmer, the system analyst, the administrator, or the end user. So at various stages of development, multiple documents have to be created for different kinds of users. In modular programming, this is the kind of programming where we have several modules that are our segments that are later combined. This documentation in such kind of programming is even more important because these different modules of the software that are developed differently by different teams, all these modules need their specific software documents, so that if any other user who is not part of the team for a particular module, if that user wants or needs to understand that kind of module, that detailed documentation will make the work easier for him or her. So this greatly applies in the open source software development. Many software communities also develop using the modular programming model. So it is even very, very important for open source software development. And I've said because many projects take the modular programming approach. Now, these are some of the guidelines that you should consider when you are creating the software documents. 1, documentation should be from the point of view of the reader. So if you are creating a software document or a program document, put yourself in the shoes of the reader. If you are the reader and you are not the developer or the person who created the software, can you really understand? Can that document guide you into understanding how the software works? So That's when you come up with a precise and a clear document when you put yourself in the shoes of the user. And number two, the document should be unambiguous. It should be very clear, precise and concise, not confusing. And number three, there shouldn't be repetition. You shouldn't repeat yourself. Number four, industry standards should be used. So don't just write any format. There should be certain format depending on the standard of the industry that you are part of. Then number five, documents should always be updated, because even the software products are usually updated, most especially in the open source communities. Some release different versions every month. So that means even the software document, if that's the pace, has to be updated every month. Number six, any outdated document should be phased out after due recording of the phase out. So once an update is made, then the outdated document should be phased out, and now the newly created or the updated format is adopted. Let's talk about the advantages of documentation. These are some of the advantages of providing program documentation. One, it keeps track of all parts of a software or a program. So with documentation, you know all parts of your software program. So in case you wanted to do any modification after some time, it's very easy for you to look at the documentation and know what you did in the previous software, and then it can give you the ground for the modification. Number two, we are saying that maintenance is easier. So it's easier to maintain software that has documentation. You know, in case you've forgotten, you know exactly where to go and where to make the modifications. Then number three, programmers other than the developer can understand all aspects of software. So if you're a programmer, you can be new to a company and you are not the original developer. If you want to understand all the aspects of the software, maybe for testing purposes, maybe if you wanted to upgrade, then you have where to begin from. Number four, documentation improves overall quality of the software. Now in software engineering, when we talk about software, we are not only looking at codes, but even the documents, the videos, the diagrams, all the illustrations, the wordings, all combined plus the program formulate what we call the software. So the overall quality of the software is improved with having documentation in place. Number five, documentation assists in user training. So if your software is well documented, you have seen many programs or software, they have the about menu. When you click on about, you can just read as a user and understand how to use that software. For example, in Microsoft Word, you can read many things and learn, for example, how to insert a table, how to insert a picture, how to make a word board, and so on. So as a user, even if you haven't got training, you can just read the about, or at times you can even press F1 for help and get the documentation. So it assists in user training. Then number six, documentation ensures knowledge decentralization. This cuts costs and efforts if people leave the system abruptly. So you have the decentralization of knowledge. Knowledge is distributed. That is, whenever you have the documentation in place, that knowledge of the software is not only reserved for the developers who did develop the software, but rather the knowledge is decentralized, meaning that any person who has the software has that knowledge, because if the documentation is well detailed, even if the developers who have that knowledge leave your company abruptly, or the organization or the community, new developers can catch up easily, can read and understand where to begin from. Okay, let's talk about the examples of documents, and we shall end with these. Examples of software documents. One, we have a user manual. This user manual usually describes the instructions and procedures for the end users to use the different features of the software. So this kind of documentation is mainly meant for the end user. It guides the user on the procedures and the steps to go through in order to use the several features of that software. Then you have the operational manual. This lists and describes all the operations being carried out and their interdependencies. So that's the operations manual. Then the design document, as you would imagine, this kind of document will describe in detail the diagrams, basically the design of the software. You know, in the software engineering, we have what we call the SDLC, the Software Development Life Cycle. And in the software development life cycle, we have design as part of the stages. And in the design, that's where we have the data flow diagrams, like the data flow diagram level 0 and level 1. Then you have the ERDs, that's the interrelationship diagrams, and some other diagrams like the UML, in which you have the use case diagrams, the sequence diagrams, the activity diagrams, and so on. So all these, we can also even have flowcharts. All these kind of diagrams are part of the design document. Then you have the requirements document. This one is one of the very first documents that you create as a software engineer. So this kind of document just has a list of all the requirements of the system, as well as an analysis of viability of the requirements. So it can have the use cases, real life scenarios, and so on. This kind of document is the one that you generate after making the requirements analysis. When you go and gather requirements and get to know the perspective or the view of the end users, what they want the system to do, you do the analysis and now come up with the system specifications. So you use this requirements documentation to list the requirements of the system. Then we have technical documentation. This is the documentation of the actual programming components. For example, the algorithms. Algorithms are simply steps that show how the program will flow. And the software engineers will just look at the algorithms and convert the algorithm into the actual codes that is in the stage of implementation of the software development life cycle. So this technical documentation can also have flowcharts that show how the program flows. It can also include the program codes themselves and their description, and then the functional modules and their detailed explanations. Then you have the testing document. This one is created when you carry out a test. So it will record the test plans, the test cases, the validation plans, the verification plan, the results of the test, and so on. As you already know, in software engineering, testing is one of the also a very important phase or stage in the software development. So it will need intensive documentation so that a person who may want to continue with the testing, to carry out more intensive tests, has a background, has somewhere to begin with, a point to start from. Okay, then we have a list of known bugs. So you can have a document that lists all known bugs in your software. We are saying that every software has bugs or errors that cannot be removed because of several reasons. For example, the bugs or the errors may be discovered very late, or the errors may have no harm, or it may take more effort for removing certain errors, and it may take maybe more time to rectify them. Sometimes software have bugs and errors that are left there if they are not doing any harm. Now these bugs have to be listed with the program documentation. Why? Because these bugs may need to be removed at a later date. If you get time, you may need to remove them, so they have to be listed clearly in the program documentation. And more so, this helps the users, the implementers, and the maintenance people. If the bug is activated, at some point the bug can now become harmful. So if it's activated, then the implementers or the maintenance people will have that knowledge about the bug and can fix it. So it's very important to have the list of the known bugs in the software. Okay, my friends, this marks the end of today's tutorial. I thank you for being good viewers and listeners and good students. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel. If you have any comment, any compliment, any question, you can comment, you can email, so I will respond. Otherwise, don't forget that Jesus is the way.